This program is brought to you by the partners of A Rood Awakening International. Help others find truth. Support A Rood Awakening International today.
Just as faith can bring hope and healing, lack of faith can bring despair and disease. That's what filmmaker Tim Mahoney called it when he was doing research for his new film, The Moses Controversy. The fourth episode of Michael and Tim's conversation about that film is coming up next, because it's the end of the sixth day. The sun is set, and this is Shabbat Night Live.
As they take this message out into the world.
Well, Shabbat Shalom, Torah fans. Welcome to Shabbat Night Live and a new month. Yes, we saw the new moon last weekend, and we are into the first official Shabbat. The month of the Aviv, the 13th month, is over, and we celebrated our Passover event here in Charlotte last weekend, and now the Passover proper is coming up in just a couple of weeks, and so we look forward to that. And we're going to talk more about what happened at Passover and the Aviv Fellowships with the director of Aviv Fellowships right now. Please welcome David Robinson.
Shabbat Shalom, Scott.
Shabbat Shalom, David.
It's
How
good
are
to
you?
see you. Great.
Welcome. So at Passover, you did a talk. I think it was your first talk we've ever done at Passover for you.
A couple of years ago, I came and spoke.
Oh,
as a
that's
guest.
right. You came
Yep.
and spoke as a
Yep.
special guest a couple of weeks. Right. But now you're part of the Rood crew, and
Rood
you
crew.
were there. And you're actually the director of Aviv Fellowships, and you've made a lot of changes. I know that you cleaned up the database so that we had folks that were really engaged there, and not just signing up for the sake of signing up.
Right.
So that folks who go to the directory can now really find a true Aviv Fellowship.
Right. Yeah. We went through and just cleaned the database up, like you said, and we were able to determine, with a few requirements, these are the fellowships. And all those who didn't say qualify as a fellowship, though, we were able to put them in that directory. So,
good.
Yeah, so then people can still find people in their hometowns. So it's really worked out really well. Great response so far.
Awesome. Now, during your talk at Passover, what exactly did you admonish people with at
Well, I think I can look back on my history coming into the Hebrew Roots movement,
Mm-hmm.
and when I came out of the church, and I just was more and more angry as I learned more and more, and blamed the church for everything, and so. I think as time has gone by, there's the scripture, 1 John 4, 7 through 21, I think it is, where it talks about, love comes from God, and if you do not have love, you do not have God.
Right.
And so I went on this journey, really studying what love is and what is missing in my life by going to Corinthians 13 and going, okay, love is patient. Am I patient? Love is kind. And I went through the different attributes and had to be honest with myself. I felt like I was becoming a Pharisee, if you will. As Michael talks about in the Sword of Division, as Paul taught, they came against him more and more because they wanted to keep the people in bondage. And so I was using knowledge, I think, as a nugget or a weapon to use against my brothers and sisters, and I was lacking love. And so we, as the Aviv Fellowships, want to be defined by love. We want to love our neighbors. We want to love people and not judge them because they're where we were. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's been, I think, a reformation that has taken place.
We need to remember that. We were all in a certain place at one point, and that's part of maturity too.
It is.
The father doesn't give trouble to the child just because the child doesn't understand.
Right.
He has to remember what he was like when he was 5 years old, right?
Yeah, that's a very good point. We have all been where our brothers and sisters are at, and so as we're coming back, if you would say the middle of the road. Coming out of the church, we ran across the road. And the reason I say that is I look at the road as the Father's looking for worshipers who worship Him in spirit and truth. And so, you have people on the far end of the spirit and doing crazy stuff, and you have people on the far end of Hebrew Roots doing stuff. And I really believe this reformation has taken place. God is bringing us back to the middle of the road.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that, because we had a meeting the other day, you and I believe Ted Clayton as well. Mm-hmm. Our chief operating officer, and we said there's something interesting happening right now, where that the Hebrew roots, as it were, it almost seems like it was for a time,
right?
And God brought us to that point to teach us something. Now He's purposely sort of letting it loose a little bit and saying, now go teach other people. Don't stay where you are. It's time to go and teach others what I've taught you.
Right, and probably one of my deepest convictions I felt the Lord speak to me was the fact that, what I was talking about a minute ago is that, I'd lost love for my brothers and sisters. And what He told me was, that the church has missed probably the greatest evangelistic opportunity in the history of the church with the Hebrew Roots movement. However, He has given us a second chance. There's a reformation taking place, and He's bringing the balance. And I think people are going to want to understand more and more about their Hebraic roots of their Christianity.
Right, and I love that checklist you brought out at Passover. That really made me sit back and think. Here's what love is. Love is patient, love is kind, keeps no record of wrongs, all that type of thing. Or do we keep records of wrong? Well, yes. We sure do. So I had to check my own spirit. Am I lining up with all these things? And I had to admit I had a lot to learn as well. So I think you're right. I think you're right on the money that love has to be our focus.
It does.
And we have to go through that checklist, and there are the prerequisites right there.
And it doesn't mean compromise. It doesn't mean we're compromising here. It's just we need to love people where they're at. And that's what Yeshua did. When He came, He loved people right where they were at.
Right.
And He even used parts of the culture to use His parables. Even part of the culture He didn't take part in, like the Greek theater that was prominent in the Galilee. He didn't go to that because what took place there was pornographic to our standards. But He knew how important it was to the people, so He used parables to teach and love them right where they were at. And that's how we win people. We love them. Love them.
Wow. Speaking of love, our love gift this month. If you enjoy what is happening on Shabbat Night Live, one of the best ways you can support the ministry and get something in return is with our love gift. And what that is, it constitutes a gift from Michael to you of a teaching. You give a $50 donation, Michael will give you this teaching. It's not for sale in our store. It's a gift, and it is not available on YouTube. You won't get it anywhere else. Just Michael reserves certain teachings for those who want to support what's happening here and help keep it going. And if you want to be part of that, you can get the love gift. This month's is called the Sword of Division. And as you were saying, it's about Paul and Barnabas who were going all over the place and teaching. And the more they taught, the more there was this wall they came up against with those who were trying to keep the Pharisaical law and keep others in bondage.
And keep them in bondage,
So that's your gift for donation of $50 or more, or if you want to give $100 or more. David, you had a lot to do with choosing this. Why don't you share what this thing is here?
Yes, this is a beautiful necklace with a pendant that's on it, and it's based on Psalms 3, and it says on the back, His name forever, Yahovah, is inscribed on the back, and I don't know if you can see that. But that's part of the second tier. It's part of the $100 love gift.
All right, and it's a leather-wrapped necklace. A beautiful thing. And in fact, my wife has said you need to get one of those. I like that. So anyway, so that's their love gift. And again, it's just a gift that we like to give back to you for giving to us and help to keep Shabbat Night Live going. So thank you for that very much. We appreciate it. And we've got coming up now. We've got Michael Rood and Tim Mahoney in the 4th episode of the Moses controversy. We're talking about the disease of unbelief today and how Tim came upon all these people he thought should know the truth and they didn't. It's a fascinating episode, and it's coming up next. But first, we're going to have more details on the love gift. Check it out.
In this month's Love Gift teaching, the apostles have been teaching the message of Yeshua all over the map. As new apostles, they are still navigating the ministry that has been given to them by Yeshua in the Great Commission.
They had no idea when the Holy Spirit was sending them on this mission that they were going to be embroiled in such a demonic attack and that they were going to be victors.
In Sword of Division, Michael Rood breaks down the ministry of Paul even further, looking at how he persevered through trial after trial while taking his message to the world. While the Pharisees remained determined to keep Israel in the bondage of Pharisaical law, Paul and the other apostles were determined to show the world another way.
Yeshua is accused of breaking the Sabbath. He is not breaking the Sabbath. It's the rabbinic Jews that are accusing him of it because he is breaking their rules and regulations that they made up, which they are not allowed to do.
Sword of Division is an exclusive teaching available only in April. It's a gift from Michael Rood to you. for your love gift donation of just $50. Or, with a love gift donation of $100 or more, we'll send you Sword of Division, plus a sword and shield pendant on a braided leather necklace. Get the Sword of Division teaching and the sword and shield pendant with braided leather necklace, a constant reminder of God's protection in the midst of our trials.
The signs and wonders happen so that people's attention is brought to the fact that the words of these brothers, Paul and Barnabas, that they are the truth, they're to be listened to, because nobody can do the miracles that they are doing except God is with them.
Call 800-788-7887 to make your love gift donation now and receive the Sword of Division collection, or visit our website at monthlylovegift.com. Hurry, offer ends April 30th.
See it now at A Rood Awakening International. The Temple Treasures exhibit. Remarkably accurate, full-scale replicas of the most precious furnishings in the tabernacle and the Second Temple. The Torah, the menorah, the table of showbread, and the altar of incense. Plus, the world's only accurate-sized model of Ron Wyatt's eyewitness account of the Ark of the Covenant. The Temple Treasures exhibit. Book your tour now at templetreasuresexhibit.com.
The traditions of modern Judaism remind us of what we did during the temple period. Not what we did, but they remind us of what we did. But the followers of Yeshua also have some other traditions, some other things that are reminders of what has been accomplished for us. They are reminders of what goes back long before the temple period, and it reminds us of what happened the very year that Yeshua was crucified and resurrected. At the Last Supper that Yeshua had with his disciples, the Greek scriptures tell us that he took artone. He took leavened bread and broke it. Of course, the English, the Greek, and all scriptures tell us that this Last Supper was before the Feast of Passover. And the following morning, the Pharisees refused to go into Pilate's judgment hall because they didn't want to be defiled so that they could eat the Passover. This is not the Passover meal. And every time we serve bread and wine gives us the opportunity, as Yeshua says, as often as you do this in remembrance of me. And so, as Yeshua said, this represents my body, which will be broken for you. This represents my shed blood. And he spoke the prayer that the Melech Tzedek shared with Abraham thousands of years ago. Baruch atah Yehovah Eloheinu melech haolam, borei pri hagafen. Blessed are you, Yehovah our Elohim, King of the universe, creator of the fruit of the vine. And Yeshua took bread, and he blessed the Most High, saying, Baruch atah Yehovah Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Blessed are you, Yehovah, our Elohim, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. As often as you do this, we do this in remembrance of him. L'chaim. The last few weeks we have been talking to Tim Mahoney, the documentary filmmaker who just released Patterns of Evidence, the Moses Controversy. And we've asked him to come back because the stories that he has to tell after more than 15 years of research into this has brought him before national leaders in the land of Israel, among the top scholars in Europe and the United States of America and the land of Israel. Tim, it's good to have you back with us. Thanks for coming back on and continuing on with this story. And I have to say, in your first Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus, I was stunned when you walked into the office of Benjamin Netanyahu in the land of Israel. And I'm seeing this as a pattern of how the Almighty has directed you. The power of God has directed you and your team in sculpting your telling of this story through these decades.
Well, What can you say? It has been unusual, the way certain things have happened. We had no intention. I had actually thought that I had a film number 2, before Patterns came out here. As I said, there were 2 films that I had made prior. We never released them. I mean, it was a lot of work, but I just knew it wasn't right. And we were in a marketing meeting, and this will bring a chuckle to you. We had came up with a great campaign. We were going to reenact the whole Exodus journey, and we were going to leave Goshen, Texas, and end up at El Paso. We're going to call it El Passover. And we're going to call it the Texodus.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wasn't that genius? And you could join.
Okay. So this was a marketing meeting.
Crazy. I'm not sure what was in the coffee or whatever, but yeah. So in the midst of this, we were trying to figure out a public relations way to do it. And we had hired a fellow who worked with the Super Bowl, so we were working with this, and we were in a big conference room, and we were having this meeting, and he went and got a letter that he read. And as he read that letter, he basically said, this is what the nation of Israel should have told the world when they're being bombed and everything. And he said, if you do any type of promotion, it should happen in Israel. And Dr. Moeller said, yes, Israel. And all I'll say is that at that moment, the barometric pressure changed in that room, and there was an unusual experience that we had that we just knew. People started to weep, and all the talk about the Texodus and all the talk about these other plans here were done, and I realized that at that moment we weren't finished. The film we had was not done, and that we were going to go to Israel. That we had to go to Israel, and my business partner David Wessner wasn't in the room, and he. And I realized I had to call him and tell him, hey, we thought we were finished and this was all done, but we're not. We need to go to Israel. And so we contacted a producer there and told her what we were doing. And she said, you know what? I think this project is very important for Israel. And so she said, who do you want to talk with? And I said, I want to talk to the leaders of your nation. I want to talk to the leaders of your nation. And I said, Benjamin Netanyahu, Shimon Peres. I want to talk to ambassadors. I want to talk to rabbis, because I want to ask them about the story of the Exodus and the formation of the nation of Israel. And so her family was, her father was a colonel, and so she had some ability to get a hold of different people. And believe it or not, we went to Israel, and we started filming, and it was an act of faith. But then the phone calls started.
That's extremely bold. Even the idea that you'd be able to go to the leaders of the nation of Israel as a Christian filmmaker and get an audience with the top leaders, that's very bold.
Right. And I'll be honest with you, I've never called myself a Christian filmmaker. I'm an investigative filmmaker.
I would have to agree.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of Christian films.
Yeah. So I just want everyone to know, I realized that, you know what, I'm a person who was raised in a Christian family, who's asking these tough questions, and I'm an investigative filmmaker. Right. And that's the reason why the films are working well, is because if I came at it from this, I would make a different kind of film.
And I'm glad you clarified that. Just me using the term, because you are giving all the evidence on this, and it's not from a Christian perspective. It's from an investigator.
David, as I said, my partner said, this is probably the most unevangelical film that you could see. In other words, it doesn't have any of that, but it's so powerful, but by the time you see it, that it has a drawing to it. So we go to Israel, and we start filming, and then I get the phone call that says, yes, you can go, you have a meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu. And at this time, he had been prime minister. He was he was like the head of his party, and he was right between the second prime minister, so he wasn't as busy. But after I did the interview, he became prime minister again. So I caught this little window, and we had to go, if you go to Knesset, there's a long walkway, and you go through security, and they practically take your camera gear and everything apart, and we had to go through all that. And then they gave me 15 minutes of time. And my heart was racing. Also they say, okay, you can go into the room. So you go into the room, it's about the size of this room. And you have to set up very quickly, and because he's going to walk in, and all of a sudden he walks in and he goes, okay, what's this all about? And my producer, Sharon, said, just tell him that a lot of people in America are going to see it. And I said, well, I'm making a film about the Exodus, and a lot of people in America are going to see it. And he said, okay. And we sit down. And I say to him, so when was the first time you heard the stories of the Bible? And he said, when I was sucking on my mother's breast. She told me the stories of the Bible. And I said, who is your favorite character in the Bible? And he says, Joseph, and it was one of his favorite. And he talked about Joseph and what happened with Joseph. And then this is what happened. The interview changed because they only had 15 minutes. You see, they had him lined up. There was news crews because he had lots of interviews to do that day. And I had a security man sitting behind me, and I was like, I don't want to, do any wrong moves or whatever. I'm just sitting there, but I was nervous. And then I said, he started talking about, he said his grandfather. When I asked him another question about the Bible, how did he learn about the Bible? He said, my grandfather taught me. And I said, and I had spent the day before that interview reading his books, Benjamin Netanyahu's books, and I read about his grandfather. Mm-hmm. And he told, so I knew his name, and I said, Nathan. So we were this close together. And once I said Nathan, all of a sudden, time stopped. And Benjamin Netanyahu said, yes, my grandfather Nathan. He said, when he was a young boy, he said he was at a train station in Poland. And he says he and his younger brother were there, and some toughs, some tough guys, teenagers or whatever, they know that they were going to capture them and beat them up. And he told the little brother to run. And Nathan was beaten up, and as they were kicking him, as he was going unconscious, he vowed that if he survived that beating, that he would get out of Poland. And that's exactly what happened, was that he did survive it. And he was the only survivor of his family. All the rest of the Netanyahus and his family were killed in the Holocaust. And so from that point on, then I started asking.
So that beating really is what saved his life and those generations after him.
Right. And from that point on, then I kept asking questions. And so you saw just a tiny little piece of this interview. Yeah. And so I had these interviews where they were not normal interviews. I talked with him for 50 to 55 minutes long. And I talked to them all through the history of the nation of Israel and the things he shared.
You've got that on film.
Yeah.
Wow.
And we talked about the destruction of Jerusalem. We talked about what happened with the Romans and all sort of the history. And we talked about, you see, there's a pattern. The pattern in the covenant is if you keep it, I will bless you. But if you break the covenant, I will destroy you as a nation. I will scatter you amongst the nations. You will be persecuted, but you will return.
Yeah.
You see, so that's a law. That's the legal deal that they have, and their ancestors made that deal.
That's right.
And so if you look at patterns of evidence and you start looking at prophecy, you can say, well, that happened twice. And I talked to a scholar once about that. And he said, they wrote that after the fact. They wrote that after the Babylonian captivity. They just made that up and they wrote that. And I said, they didn't do it. That doesn't apply to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. So what I'm saying to you is that, and then so.
But you can't say that it was written after that.
No. So you can see the pattern. And you can see these things happening. So this is where patterns of evidence can go in the future. But that interview with Benjamin Netanyahu was so powerful. And then I had another one which was the birth of the rebirth of the nation of Israel with Shimon Peres. And that interview, I have to tell you that it was like electricity in the room. And he shared, because he was with Ben-Gurion, and he was there during all that time. So Shimon, you can tell when you're with a great leader, there's an aura about these men. And there's a sense of this. And I think that they knew that when we had these interviews, that there was something different. There's something different about these interviews.
Yeah.
And they opened up, and they have shared things that are waiting to be told at the right time. And that's where we're heading, is down here. And I came up with an understanding, and I wrote this line once. It said, the understanding is that God brought the Israelites to Mount Sinai so that he would reveal who he is to them, so that in the future they would reveal who he is to the world.
Right. And that's what really we're called to be. You know, if you will keep my commandments, this is what the contract was, then you will be my segula. You'll be my precious treasure. You'll be a nation of priests and kings. We'll be responsible to get the word out to the nations of the world, and he put us in a parcel of land through which all the trade routes of the world went right straight through there. Because as it says, David, I believe it was the one that prophesied, he said that he divided the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel, who were yet unborn when he divided the nations at the Tower of Babel. But he had a reason for breaking apart Nimrod's Novus Ordo Seclorum, the New World Order of its day, and scattering the people according to these 70 languages, because he was going to put a people in place they would reveal himself to, and they would reveal him to the world. And now you're involved with that very thing, helping the nation of Israel reveal this to the world by taking them right back to Moses, and there you are in the prime minister's office.
Yes, and so it's like, you know, when we think about Mary, she pondered these things, you know. So there are things that happen in our lives, and I think that we all potentially have them if we're aware of them. And they happen over a period of time. And it's not at the time you don't recognize that, but if you look back, you start seeing certain things. You start seeing the connection. You start seeing the pattern, right? And so as I looked at this, there are, if we think about the prophet Isaiah, when it says, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. You know, there's mountains and there's valleys. Well, there's valleys of doubt, there's mountains of confusion, there's all these different things that get in the way of people believing that this is God's word and that he's speaking to us. And so patterns of evidence, in a way, is a way of removing those valleys and removing those mountains that help people to see that this is what it is. And I'm still trying to walk that line where I'm not over-advocating or under-advocating. I'm bringing it, I'm a mediator to basically bring these questions in and to mediate the big questions of God acting in history. And that's, basically, what I'm about. And as I do that, I see that people are fatally struck with the truth. I can't do that. That's the work of, that's how God works. But then they own it, you see. And I think we're coming to a place where we have to own what we believe. And if we've got those questions, that's why I appreciate the craziness of these Exodus explorers at times that are trying to own what they believe. Not many people do that. And they go out and do that. That's why I'm telling their story. And I'm looking at the whole history of that.
Yeah, and this quite fascinating to see this younger generation getting involved in it. And now you're telling their story, because their story really tells his story and what you have been trying to put together for all this time. This I hope that we're going to see in the future. I know that we have the Red Sea crossing that's going to be coming up. We have Mount Sinai. It's coming up after that. But it sounds like this is patterns of evidence for the whole Bible.
Yes, that's correct. And now that sounds like an overly ambitious idea, but we'll see how far we can get. I plan.
Yeah, Genesis 1:1 to Revelation 22:21. I mean the patterns that are in that. It's like, that's how I teach. People ask the questions, and it's like, I have to put together, sometimes you have to put together the end from the beginning. You have to tie it all together. The patterns are unbelievable, and this is your life.
Yeah. And what I found is that oftentimes people quit before they even try. And so they're defeated before they even start. And I didn't realize that it would take this long. But you see, a lot of it was training. A lot of it was understanding and training. And so now
you didn't know you're going through a training at the time. It's, you were just trying to do the job, but you kept on getting sent down different paths.
Yeah. And, let's just say when people are pharmaceutical companies or medicine or whatever, there's a long process to try to understand how to cure something. And what we've learned is that when people take a patterns of evidence approach, they can absolutely, in a very short, quick time, they've gotten the answer. The problems that they've been facing have been answered, and all of a sudden they're free. They're free to believe. And my definition of faith is that it's not just faith from sometimes you see what happens is that I'm showing that the history of the Bible, there's a pattern that's matching it. But faith is also about the present, and it's about the future. Do I have faith that the God of the Bible will keep His word today? Because you see, or in the future. Yeah. Or am I kind of coasting? Am I just a coaster? And I'm kind of a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And so I'm thinking that as I'm starting to see these patterns and starting to experience this, I'm becoming more active. And I think that's what happens with people. They become more engaged in what they believe. And if you really believe it, and the sad part is that I think there are some people that say they're agnostics, but they're acting really like atheists. In other words, they've got questions, but they don't actually, when they get an answer, they don't like that answer, and they're just rejecting what they're hearing. But there are some Christians that are saying that they're Christians, but they're actually acting like agnostics. They don't actually act like they believe.
Yeah. As the prophecy of Moses, and this is the thing that you bring out in this latest film, this prophecy of Moses, and what Yeshua said, if you believe Moses, you'd believe in me. And what Moses said, the messianic prophecy, is that when Moses went up into the mountain with the response of the people, they said, please don't let us hear like this from the Almighty again, with this fire, this lightning, this thunder, this earthquaking. Please, Moses, you go up and you get the message from him and come back down and tell us, and we promise we'll obey. And so Moses did that. He went back up into the mountain and into the presence of the Almighty, and he said, they've well spoken that which they have spoken. I'm not going to speak to them like this again. I will tell you, Moses, and they must hear and obey you. But I'm going to send another prophet in the future. And that prophet, they must shema. They must hear and obey that prophet, or they will be judged. As Peter quotes this, it says in the book of Acts, he says, they have to listen to that prophet or they will be destroyed. It is an eternal verity right there. And this is the prophecy. This is the messianic prophecy. And for the most part, the Christian world is ignoring that prophecy. They're not listening to the words of Yeshua. They're not doing what he said to do. They will say his name, but as far as really living like he said it and living like God is alive and real and is there to take us into eternity, into the promises in eternity, it's like those promises are never made because they're not in touch with Moses in the past And that's what you're doing, taking us and putting us in touch with Moses in his words as he wrote them.
The scene that you're describing is actually in the Moses Controversy, the new film. When they're called to the mountain and the lightning and they're all afraid and everything. When I'm making these films, sometimes I'm not always sure exactly why I'm putting certain scenes in. There's certain things that happen in them.
That is the scene.
That is the scene, right?
Yeah.
And so the Moses Controversy basically reveals that event as it happened, and that God is revealing himself to these people. And he's saying, okay, I'm going to covenant with you. I'm going to make a covenant with these people. And it shows this in this film. And that's why I think these films are what I would say is a film of remembrance and a film of forewarning. And if you think about, some people might think, well, this happened 3,500 years ago. But if you do math, let's say, what would you say a generation is? I mean, we'll just pick one, 40 years or 70 years, or which one would you like?
Okay.
Well, 70 years. Okay.
Let's say 70 years.
Okay, 70 years. Well, not to test your math skills too hard here, but if you take your grandfather and he lives for 70 years, and then another person is born a grandchild and they live for 70 years, it only is 50 generations back to the time of the Exodus. Only 50. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We think this is ancient history. Only 50 lives of 7 years old back. It's not that long ago. And we're only here for just doesn't the prophet say we're just like a flower, and then we fade? And so that's why I think it's important that we understand what's going on here, that we are not distracted by the things of the world. It distracts us with all sorts of things, but so that's why this is important. That's why I think it's important to understand what's at stake.
I think we need to take this now into the next generation.
Right.
Tim, in the first two films of the Patterns of Evidence film series, I realized that this is really going to go into the next generation, into the younger generation. This is to whom this is really addressed, because they're the ones that are going to need to unbury themselves from all the traditions of men, all the traditions of philosophy, and get back to the scriptures.
Well, you and I grew up in a different time, and there was a time when the Bible had much more respect. And today, my grandkids are telling me that, kids at school they talked about the Bible and they said, well, that's not true. There's nothing true in the Bible.
It's like the first response that comes out of their mouth. This is what they've learned from the generation before them.
Yeah, from their parents, So we're living in a different time, and I think that that's why, we talk about this idea of unbelief. It's like a cancer, or it's some type of a disease of unbelief. And it starts, like if I go back to the question in the garden, did God really say? Don't really believe that God really said that you're not supposed to eat of this tree. And the very first question in the Bible is a questioning, And as we said, as I'm talking about it, some people might be confused, but I'm saying that it's okay to have questions, but you have to find the answers. It's when you have the questions that don't get answers, and then you start to not believe. And if you don't believe that what God is saying is what He said, then that puts you on a different course in life. And so these children that we have, you do have to answer questions. And I think that Patterns of Evidence exposes them to questions that people are going to raise, that they're going to be faced with. But if you can, in a sense, vaccinate them to those questions and give them a cure, an answer for that, and to say, when someone says, there's no evidence for the story of the Bible, of the Exodus, and there's no evidence that Moses existed, they can say, excuse me, by the way, there is. And here's where the pattern is showing. And I'll tell you that I got an email that actually a woman came up to me at a conference, and she was a young woman she was from Africa. And she went off to a Christian university It was a mainstream university, but she didn't know, and she wasn't a Christian originally. She had converted to Christianity. And so she went to this school, and she was doing a Bible class, and the professor there told her, these stories didn't happen. And she was, shocked by that. She's saying, "What are you telling me? I've become a believer in the Bible and in God, and have accepted this as my faith, and now you're telling me that this isn't true?" And someone told her when she was talking about this problem, they said, "You need to see patterns of evidence." And so she basically stayed up all night and researched it and watched it at that time it was on Netflix. And she came back the next day to her professor and says, "What you said is not true. There is evidence for the Exodus. You need to see patterns of evidence." And he said, "What are you talking about?" And so he ended up watching it, and she's told me, she says, "Do you know that my professor changed his course?" And he basically changed what he was saying. And we went from a woman who potentially could have had her faith wiped out. And in our film, The Moses Controversy, we show 3 men that were raised in Christian homes, Bible-believing homes, eventually went off to college and were told that there's no evidence for these events, and eventually walked away from a faith. And so the issue for you and your family is that, am I going to prepare them? Am I going to give them the tools and the information so that when they're dealing with this historical credibility of the Bible, that they are prepared to have answers for it? And they believe and can have a good understanding of what that is.
Tim, you've mentioned it a couple times over the last couple of weeks. And I think that statement that is just, it's really ringing in my ears. The serpent says, "Did God really say?" That is the question. Did God really say?
Right.
That can be applied to so many things across the board, and realizing that came out of the mouth of the serpent, the one that deceived Eve, that basically Adam handed over the dominion of the world to him because of that question. Did God really say? And this is the thing that we have to confront the next generation with. Did God really say this? If God really said this, whatever it is, then it demands a response from us. If God said it, then it demands a response. If he didn't say it, then we're going to respond another way.
Yes, and I started to realize as I was doing the investigation are these the words that were given by God, or are these just the words of men, written 1,000 years later? And that's the reason why the first 2 films, the Moses, or Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus, and Patterns of Evidence, the Moses Controversy. The Moses Controversy, as we go forward with the investigation, we had to know, were these the words that were written? And how would we be able to test that? Can we even find a writing system? And to my surprise, there is this connection to the Israelites, and you can see the time frames match up and line up with the early Israelites being in Egypt. If you look at the first film, you can say, hey, there's a connection. I mean, it's right at the same time. And it shows that, and it raises the question, well, here we have at this place in the world, and at this time in history when the Israelites were there, that there's a writing system that was able to then write down the words of God acting in history from Genesis, and then record, it says, write this down in the book to Moses, and he was able to write it. He had that ability. But the key is not just that he could write it, but that the writing system was so simple, which is the beginning of the alphabet, was so simple that you and I could learn to read it. We could read it as a young age, because what does it say? Write this on a doorpost. Moses tells them, write these commandments on the doorpost and teach them to your children.
Miles Jones was the one that assisted Jim and Penny Caldwell in deciphering some of the pictographs, some of the Proto-Sinaitic pictographs that were found over in Saudi Arabia. And in his book, he was talking about this this alphabet that was developed, that the Bible is communicated in, and he was bringing into play that this is what helped these people to understand things, articulate things that really developed just about a society of geniuses. As we see it even today, the Jews are the ones that get the majority of Nobel Prizes in science from around the world and in medicine and all these areas. Mm-hmm. And Miles Jones actually has a course, and it was televised in Texas, in which it was called Jones's Geniuses. He would take second graders and third graders where English wasn't their first language, teach them advanced mathematics, and they would compete against Mensa Society geniuses with calculators, and his second and third graders would beat them in time on these very things, because he said he was teaching them the basics that goes back to that ancient alphabet that was given at Mount Sinai.
That's tremendous. I've met Miles, and we've done interviews, and as we're trying to basically, you see, patterns of evidence is an ongoing investigation. So that's why there's thousands of hours of interviews and filming as we're sorting it out. So we're going to continue to explore this early alphabet. And not only that,
I'm excited about it because you're breaking ground that just hadn't even crossed my mind. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm so appreciative of what you've done. But now that it continues then.
And what you can see is that the connection between what was written, and is there any connection to the biblical narrative? And some of the people that we're interviewing are saying that there is, and that they're seeing connections. So that's basically where we're going in the future as we continue to unfold these films. And I'll share one other thing, is that we do have even curriculum for your children, educational curriculum for homeschool, and I think it's important that we just really work at helping our children to be prepared for what they'll experience, and our grandchildren when they get out of our home. And I think that this is a project that I had no clue. I mean, honestly, I thought this would only take 1 year. And it's taken now, I'm in year 17, almost year 18, because I was leading up to that. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the rest of my life I'll be working on patterns of evidence. And we're hoping to produce more of these films. We've got a lot of material and research that's going out there as we're going and laying out these future episodes. And we're excited about the Red Sea, the miracle of the Red Sea, as we're preparing that right now. I'm in the middle of that film.
Yeah. Now, this is very interesting to me. I know that as you ended the last one, the Moses controversy, you are showing that miracle of the Almighty literally carving in stone with the finger of God, carving in the commandments into these tables of stone. And so this is a supernatural act of God. This is not something that happened naturally. And when we do talk about the Red Sea crossing, there are a lot of people that want to say this is a natural thing that happened, and try to explain that away by some natural thing, but you do not negate the act of the Almighty in doing things that are outside of our realm of experience. Then,
correct. I mean, we're going to look at in that film. We're going to look at the naturalistic and the supernatural. So we've basically interviewed and have a pretty in-depth investigation into, well, why do you believe that if an exodus happened across the sea, where when people look at Egypt and they look at those areas for border lakes along Egypt, and they say that the exodus, the sea that was crossed, was called the Sea of Reeds, or is it the Sea of Boundary, where Dr. Glenn Fritz has talked about being Yam Suf being the Gulf of Aqaba, or even the Gulf of Suez. So we're going to explore and show things that people hadn't seen before about the Red Sea, the miracle of the Red Sea crossing, and raise the question of miracles. And can miracles happen? And what is the documented proof of miracles happening. And I've gotten those interviews, so I've been working on that. And that's the next film that we're working on this year.
Well, that kind of brings us full circle, because when you and I first met, I had just been down at the crossing site at Nueva, was camping there for a few weeks on the beach, then on up to Cairo. And then from Cairo, the next thing, I believe it was Nashville, if I'm not mistaken, where the Christian Booksellers Convention was, and the International Christian Filmmakers meeting was, that you were attending that. Yeah. And that's where we connected at that moment in time, and it was about the Red Sea crossing that found that it was inspiring to both of us. We both were driven to really get to the bottom of this.
If I sort of wrap up these films, is that I realize that words have meaning, and if this is called the Word of God. And if we look at these words, are these words inspired? That's what the Bible is telling us, that this is God revealing His plan. We're hearing the stories of how this came about. So it's important for us to know, are these, what are these words saying, and how to react to them. And if you think about the different people, such as Joshua, he said, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." He was telling what the story and what this story is, and we're trying to understand that. And that's the question that I've raised for myself, and I think for other people, they need to ask that question. If these words that are written are true, then how are we going to react, and how are we going to move forward, and what are we going to put our money where our mouth is? Are we going to live our life the way that is supposed to be? And that's the journey that I've been on. And I think that for our children, and grandchildren, because as I'm older now and I've got grandchildren, I don't want them to be distracted or deceived, and I want them to basically be able to know what the truth is, because there's a bigger story here. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a future, and where are we going to be in the future, and what's going to happen. And that's the reason why I'm generous with the scholars that don't believe, because maybe they never really heard the whole story, or maybe they don't quite understand it.
I'm convinced that is true. They have not heard the story. They've not heard it from anyone who could intelligibly articulate the truth of the Scripture. They've just seen people tear it apart, and they had no way to defend themselves.
Yeah. And so it's important, I think, just as you realize, the chronology is important. If you unfold things in time, it's easier for people to come along and basically understand where they are, and then they can make a decision. And I think that's what Patterns of Evidence is really about, is it's unfolding the past so that you can make a decision today about what's going to happen in the future.
I think from what I have seen in your productions, I can say with even more confidence that all Scripture is given by inspiration of God. It's profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfected, truly perfected unto all good works. And God has given us His Word so that we know how to govern ourselves in this life, so that we can live it to its fullness. And I believe that you are helping us pass that on to the next generation, so that they truly can study the Word of God to show themselves approved unto God, that they can become workmen that do not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. That the words of Paul concerning the education of our offspring, and as he was raised every morning hearing the word of God, as he went to school, as they sat at the table, as he lived in that Jewish culture as the son of a Pharisee, but yet he was taught the Scripture from his youth, and this is our responsibility to bring it to the next generation, and that's what you're doing. You're young explorers, the films that you're continuing to do. Thank you for all that you do for His glory and for His kingdom. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, Torah fans, this has been a wonderful time with Tim Mahoney. Make sure that you get Patterns of Evidence. You get both of the episodes that are now available, not only the Exodus, but also the Moses controversy. Make sure that you get it into the hands of your friends, your family, your children, your grandchildren. Give them the strength. Give them the background so that they will have the backbone to stand up against a sick, twisted, and perverse world. This is our opportunity. This is the only generation that we get to be alive in, so this is the last generation as far as we're concerned. And this is where it all meets the final thing. The final judgment is going to be dependent upon what we do in this life and for him. Thank you for joining us. Shabbat Shalom. Shavua Tov. Have a good week. We'll see you back here next week for Shabbat Night Live.